Okay, let's look at the brain today. We're seeing a number of structures, including the cerebral structures, or the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and we can see part of the brainstem. Some features that stand out right away is this major sulcus here, the lateral sulcus. You can see here the central sulcus, which splits the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The lateral sulcus separates the temporal lobe from the parietal and frontal lobe, and the occipital lobe has a little bit messier of a separation. Now these folds, those are where it folds in is the sulci. This would be a sulcus. Where it's sticking out is a gyrus. So the precentral gyrus is in front of the central sulcus. The postcentral gyrus is posterior to the central sulcus. Inside of the precentral gyrus is the primary motor cortex, and here would be the primary somatosensory cortex. Looking at the cerebellum, we see folds and they look a little different. They're much higher, highly folded, and we call these folds the folia. And you can see that there's two portions. There's this superior portion, inferior portion. This is actually the anterior lobe. This is the posterior lobe. Now we're going to look a little bit from the anterior view. We can see the medulla oblongata, the pons, and we can see the shadow where the midbrain is. And we can see a number of structures. This raised region of the medulla oblongata would be the pyramids. The medullary olives are here. This anterior portion of the pons that has these lateral fibers connects the cerebellum. That is the cerebellar peduncles. This region here in the midbrain between cranial nerves 3 and 4 is the cerebral peduncles. Looking more, we can see these two ball-looking structures. Those are the mammary bodies. Here we can see this X or H structure that is the optic chiasm, where the optic nerve comes from. So now we're going to have to split open the brain model to view some more structures. Let's look in here. So first of all, one of the gyri that we can see is the cingulate gyrus. We can also see this structure called the corpus callosum. This structure, brain structure here, is the fornix. And then we get to the septum pellucidum here. This structure here is going to be a choroid plexus full of ependymal cells. And one thing that should be noted, this is a little bit of a depression because that's the third ventricle. Septum pellucidum here is separating the lateral ventricles, which are on the other side of this third ventricle. Here we can see the intermediate mass of the thalamus. This is also the thalamus, but if we were to poke a hole through the septum pellucidum, we'd see a larger area of the thalamus. Here we see the hypothalamus and the beginning of the infundibulum, and we would expect right where my wooden rod is to find the pituitary gland in the sella turcica. This little structure here is the anterior commissure. We have the posterior commissure. Then you have this structure here called the epithalamus, the epithalamus being the pineal gland. Okay, back to the third ventricle, we can see there's a pathway through the midbrain into the space between the fourth ventricle. This is the fourth ventricle in front of the cerebellum. And then that eventually keeps going inferiorly to either form a channel to the subarachnoid space or through the central canal of the spinal cord. These two small bumps here are part of the corpora quadgemina, the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. Another thing we notice in the cerebellum are these white fibers that have these little trees coming off of them. We call them the tree of life or the arbor vitae. This right here is the side view of the cerebellar peduncles that we saw here with these lateral fibers. The cerebral peduncles are going to be right here with the anterior most fibers called these crus cerebri, right? And this is going to be the midbrain here, the diencephalon here, the pons here, and the medulla oblongata. So the midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata make up the brain stem.